Conrad, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us. It's going to be quite an enjoyable talk. You've got 28 years in asset management. I mean, you've gone from Fidelity to setting up your own firm. It must have been quite a journey, and it still continues today. So we really want to learn more about what you went through. And I think it would be great for the audience because some of the people in the audience may not have experience in asset management. If you could go through the typical asset management company and all the different roles inside that company.
Yep, sure. Happy to do that. In fact, I joined the asset management industry straight after NYU. I still remember that there was a class by Professor Stephen Brown, who is the author of the book Random Walk Down Wall Street that a lot of the alumni must have read. He talked in one of the sessions, he talks about how do you pitch to an AT&T pension fund, which he was responsible for running, and just assume that you are part of that. That is the job that I started with at Fidelity. And for people who do not understand asset management well enough, just think about it this way. In the financial services industry, it is in fact a very long value chain. Starting from one end, you have companies who work with corporate finance, and then they will sell the shares or bonds to you on behalf of this company by the brokerage division. Someone is selling while someone is buying. It can be the direct investors, a pension fund or a Mr. Smith on the street, but it can also be a portfolio manager working on behalf of a fund or a separate account. And that is what we call asset management. And that's why people call us the buy side.
Now, everyone, I think when they think about asset management, they think about portfolio managers. But your career has been focused on a different area of an asset management company. I think it'll be useful for the audience to understand what that role is and why it was so critical that without your contribution, you and your colleagues in this side of the business, they wouldn't have any money to actually buy any bonds or equity or any sort of financial instrument.
That's correct. This is the capital raising role within the asset management firm, be it public equities, fixed income, or private equities or hedge fund. Everybody has to raise capital. If you think about some of the biggest private equity managers that we see today, usually one of the partner is the one responsible for capital raising, because at the very beginning, you need to have money before you can deploy. And this particular function is an important part of the value chain. But having said that, I would not understate the importance of investment, because at the end of the day, an asset management firm is able to raise capital simply because of the investment track record. Even though every day we say that the past record is no guarantee of future return, and it's true. However, without the track record, how can someone understand and ascertain that you can repeat something at all?
That's great. So we'll talk about a bit later about what skill sets are required for portfolio management and what skill sets is required for fundraising on the part of an asset management company. But we've got your bio. You've been through a number of firms. You've had very long stints in some of them as well. I think it'd be great if you run through with us some of these companies, your roles in those companies, and most importantly, some milestones in your career that you'd like to highlight that really has given you this opportunity to set up your own firm and going through 28 years in this business.
Okay. I started my career back at Fidelity in Hong Kong, right after I graduated from NYU. That was my first job. It was an interesting beginning because I didn't quite know what I was getting into, but I think my boss knew it better than I did, because I brought a combination of skill sets of being quantitative, yet being somewhat more articulate. And that was a very important starting point, because I learned a lot about the fund management industry, how good portfolio managers do their work, and how sometimes even a good portfolio managers in front of a very efficient market, you still cannot outperform. And then during my years at Fidelity, I also started my studying of CFA, And I did finish my CFA within 3 years, and that was very useful. But then that put me on a crossroad, whether I wanted to switch over to the side of managing money or staying on the path of capital raising. I chose the latter. It is really because of a reflection of my own personality, as well as my skill set, as well as being a portfolio manager is actually a pretty competitive job. And you are competing against many, many smart people, many smart and hardworking people. But if you are in the capital raising field, you probably have a bit more control over your own life and your own career. That's how I felt. So I continue on that path and then spent another 3 years with ABN AMRO, a European firm, also in the asset management division, doing similar work. And then after those 2 jobs, I started my career in alternatives in a more serious way. I joined AIG Investment, which is the predecessors of PineBridge today. And that was a serious part of my career. I spent about 9 years at AIG, knowing every part of alternatives because AIG was a large investment manager with their own balance sheet to deploy. So they could do a lot of things that a typical manager would not be able to do. So I got a very good chance and understanding of different parts, different areas of investments. And then I also
Conrad, would you give the audience an idea of what it means when you say alternative investments?
Okay, sure. The book definition is that anything that is not mainstream are alternatives. So at one stage, if you study in the CFA curriculum, international equities was part of alternatives at one stage. But of course, today is not because we are in a pretty globalized world. So by today's definition, it probably includes hedge funds, private equities, real estate, as well as private infrastructure.
Okay.
Okay, so that is what I got exposed to at AIG. And also when I contrast with my time back at Fidelity, I could really feel that alternatives is the way to go. It is actually quite intuitive. Just think about it this way. You are getting into something that is not mainstream. You will have less competition. The market will be more efficient. There are more ways to add value. And to some extent, the explanation is also more complicated, which actually fits my career inspiration as well as my skill sets. Explaining complicated concept to investors in a way that they can relate to. So I spent about 9 years at AIG, did a lot of things, and I even took the opportunity to set up the Middle East office on behalf of AIG Investments back in 2005, when a time that there were no Americans or British would like to be in the Middle East. I grabbed that opportunity, and that was a very rewarding one. It opened up, it helps to open my eyes. And then I stayed loyally with AIG for a long time, until one point that AIG was caught in the middle of the global financial crisis. It was in fact right at the center of the storm. And then only at that point, I recognized that as part of an investment organization, I needed to find a new platform to rebuild my career on a more solid ground or a new ground. So I didn't quite get there straight away, but I did accept an offer from Credit Suisse, and I stayed there for 18 months, helped them to fix quite a few things, and raised about $2 billion within that 18 months together with my team. And it also gave me an opportunity to work with, for example, Global Infrastructure Partners, GIP, when it was trying to form a fund too, after knowing that Credit Suisse and GE were not going to back their fund too. So I did get a chance to work with today's one of the greatest infrastructure GP in the world. So I think those 18 months were really well spent.
Actually, Conrad, before you go on with the rest of the firms, I think that's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of people don't realize when these global crises occur, they are also opportunities. And if you can position yourself well, you can take the next leap forward. In terms of what you were doing at AIG, I mean, AIG was obviously caught up on the super senior CDOs and all the purchases of that, ultimately hitting their capital. What was it like? I think very few people have gone through, at least the younger people have not gone through as many crises as you and I have. So I distinctly remember 2008, okay? Because 2008 I was at Merrill and I was running the Asian securitization and mortgage desk. So it was obviously one of the biggest desks that got financially hit. What was it like at AIA? I think if you could give people some highlights of what that year was like in your career.
I was pretty cool during the crisis. I can remember that there was already a rumor in the market that if AIG goes down tomorrow, 5 banks would go down together with AIG, including however, so I there was not much to do in the office, so I finished work earlier than usual, back home by 6 p.m., take my shower, relax, and then watch some US news. And
that's very good, Conrad. My life was like that movie, if you recall, it's called Margin Call, which talks about MBS and having to sell so many bonds. It was extremely stressful. It was probably one of the worst times in my life.
It was stressful in a way for lots of people. So I still remember that I finished watching on the US news during my evening, saying that whether AIG is going to get a 30 billion lifeline from the Fed. So when I wake up in the morning, I turned on the TV and wanted to see whether AIG got that 30 billion. No, it's 70 billion now.
Oh, that's great. All right, go on. You were talking about after CSFB.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so after CSFB, that was another changing point in my career. I started to, at CSFB, I recognized that I had probably 7 to 8 pieces of puzzles out of 10 to do something that is quite different, becoming part of a placement agent. Credit Suisse, in fact, had one of the best placement team in the world at that time, and it still is a very respectable firm. And when I was leaving Credit Suisse Asset Management, I actually had a chance to join that part. But I figured that I wanted to do something that is more entrepreneurial, because I really want to build my own company and run my own company at one stage of my life. So I have to think about, in the scheme of things, what am I going to do in the next 10 years? Do I just want to be a MD at a large investment bank, or do I want to do something different? So I chose to work with a British firm that already has a New York office called Campbell Lutyens in the placement industry. It competes head-to-head with other placement advisors, including Credit Suisse, UBS, Park Hill, etc. back then. But I figured that when I joined the firm, it was a transatlantic firm. But the minute I joined, it became a global firm.
That's right.
I had a bit of value arbitrage, but then it is also a very interesting one, because I took equity in the firm, and then one day you wake up and start to look at the world differently. So have I joined a good company? I don't know, because it is a good company only if I can perform well. So I did get a bit more ownership as well as influence on the outcome of the firm. So that is where I spent another 10 years building Campbell Lutyens together with my partners into a truly global firm. And we had the leadership in private infrastructure, capital raising, as well as secondary advisory. And that actually brings me to my next stage of career, which is where I am now. Because you may notice that from Fidelity, it was pretty much a generalist to start off with. And then at AIG, I still had public equities exposure, but gradually I recognized that what I really wanted to do are something in the private markets, I don't want to do hedge funds because that's different. That doesn't fit my skill set. And then private real estate, this is a very old industry. So there are lots of established players, and private equity is probably a bit too exciting for me, especially when it comes to venture capital. But what I figured out along the way was infrastructure is actually at the beginning of its history. And I started working on the first infrastructure fund back in 2003. Now it is a very established asset class, but when I started working on it, it was an unknown to a lot of people. And then when you look at where we are in today, the field of infrastructure still has a very long runway. In the developed markets, a lot need to be rebuilt, and it is a relatively safer asset class. However, it is actually quite crowded in the OECD countries. But I find a new runway, which is in China. Chinese infrastructure, namely renewables or digital infrastructure such as telecom tower and data center, these are assets that really promising, but they are not funded by sophisticated capital. I'm not saying that corporates are not sophisticated, but if you compare how things are being financed or funded in the developed world, China's infrastructure, a lot of them were still being built by SOEs. But China wants to open up. They want to learn about this part as well. So I found a partner who is someone that I was tracking back at Campbell Lutyens since 2010. So I've known him for 10 years. We have been friends for a long time. And then I had even introduced our current backer, which is Manulife, to him. I was the matchmaker. And then in the 11th hour, they invited me to join as well. So I joined them. And it is very interesting because I see this as my last play in my career. So I want to do something that is impactful on the world. I can certainly say that I am fighting climate change. On behalf of your children and my children, we are trying to make the world a better place. And if you want to fight climate change and you are not doing it in China, from China, you are not moving the needle. Because as we all know, China is the manufacturing powerhouse. And they do consume a lot, but they are actually using the resources to build products for many people in the world. And then the second thing that I really want to achieve is to actually help capital to take advantage of opportunities in places that they are not familiar with. If there's any one lesson that we mankind have learned from the Second World War, it was that if you are invested in me and I'm invested with you, and it's very difficult to decouple.
Yes.
And then it is very difficult to start a war. If you try to bomb a data center, that actually is owned by your own pension fund.
Correct. Well, that's great. Thank you for that. I think what we can take away from your career is that you have been fairly systematic. It's not just a random walk in the market. You actually, at different steps, you've analyzed your situation and you've thought about it and actually deliberately geared towards a certain direction, which you said was also introspective. You looked into yourself, your skill set, what your interests are, and then you move towards that. That's quite interesting. I think one thing, again, about your career is that you spent a fairly long time for people of our generation in one firm. That's quite admirable. I've seen people move around quite often. Even my own career is probably 3.5 years at a firm, but you've done much longer stints. Could you help the audience, some of the younger audience, that what do you need to think about before you should move jobs? Should you be concerned about frustration that you have at your current firm? You're not moving fast enough, okay? Is compensation the primary objective, or is this something more systematic that you've described as you're trying to chart your career?
Okay, I can share the framework that I used to use when I look at my career, because there are always three elements: money, the firm, and the people that you're working with. I think at the first stage of your career, the firm is probably the most important consideration. Then the people that you're working with is number two, and then money is the last. And I don't want to go into details of how the order shifts at different stages, but they do shift. And then at some stage of your career, you recognize that the most important things is the people that you're working with, which is where I'm right now. And then talking about the people, and you would also, over the years, I've also noticed that in our industry, you're working with a lot of smart people. Some of them are working very hard as well, but that still probably represent 25 to 30% of the people that you're working with. And then you must give yourself, be very devoted to match them, to have a chance of staying on par with them. But there is one other dimension that one can benefit from, which is hang around long enough. It sounds very simple, but if you think about this, there is a belief that everyone can only get enough insights when you work on something for 10,000 hours. And 10,000 hours, it actually is about 3.5 years. So after you have done something for 3.5 years, you probably have figured out something. But then I think it would be too early to move on right away. Because it is actually the best time to start harvesting. You can reap the best benefit. You probably have the best pricing power. You probably can get the best compensation and also advance in your career. Because if you make MD in one firm versus negotiating in a job hunt and get to the MD level at another firm is completely different. Because in the former case, you earn your stripes. But I'm not suggesting that one should just hang around in one firm for the entire career, because it is, first of all, it is a bit boring. And secondly, you also have to think about things that are beyond your control, such as the GFC, etc. And there is only one thing that is quite certain. There are business cycles. The first business cycle was documented in the Bible. That was about 7 years long. And I think it is still around that kind of length, if not shorter. But then for whatever you do, you should not expect to be able to earn the same amount of money by doing the same thing after one business cycle. And that is also about the time that you have to think about how do you reinvent your career or reinvent what you do. And that is how I determined that, for example, after spending 10 years with my previous firm, I figured that I am running out of time. I must do something different.
Oh, that's a very interesting process, thought process. You know, we've also gone through your bio and noticed that you've done a lot of work with different not-for-profit industry standard organizations. If you can give everyone an idea of why you did it, what interests you in it, and do you think it's something that people in any industry should think about and do, and not just focus on one thing such as their job?
Mm-hmm. I definitely think so, because I do enjoy my job and I spend a lot of time at it. It can be financially rewarding, but I actually value a lot about my extracurricular activities. First of all, if you are being too focused on your job, you are giving up the opportunities to learn. Yes, for example, as an analyst or a stock research analyst, you do read a lot, but you don't necessarily learn a lot. You probably learn a lot more by working with very intelligent people rather than reading from research papers. So I see that initially as part of my continuing education. But then there are only 24 hours in a day. And I don't exaggerate, but I typically work about 12 hours a day. And some people claim that they work 16, 20 hours a day, but I doubt whether that is sustainable in life.
More efficient.
Yeah, that's true. That's true too. But what I recognized was that I try to do something that synergistic or accretive. That, for example, I serve as the secretary of a pension fund organization. That I get a chance to, where I get a chance to rub shoulders with CIOs and CEOs. These are pretty helpful connections. And then I learn with them. And at the same time, I also build connections that can be beneficial to my business. And then I also have some involvement with the CFA Institute and also at the local CFA society level. And some of this started with a idea contribution. For example, I got involved with the local CFA society when they were launching global investment performance standards around the world. And I thought I had a shortcut to make things a lot more impactful and bear results much faster. So I contributed that idea, and then I was asked to implement it. And then it worked
out. Excellent.
Yeah, but then the more you do, the more you get involved, then you actually would find it pretty rewarding. And this is also a way that you can give back to the younger generation as well, because there are lots of younger people who have the energy and the time to do things that that I may not have anymore. Then I can just coach them and create a bigger impact on the world.
Excellent, excellent. I think let's go now and look forwards. We've talked about a lot of what happened in the past. In terms of your current firm, and you're looking at sustainable energy and digital infrastructure in China, what are the investment opportunities like?
Abundant. And I think this is really beyond today's imagination as well. Even though our firm focuses on things that can generate stable revenue straight away, but we are actually operating in a very exciting part of the world and exciting time as well, because we are really going through an energy revolution. This is about the old energy system that was based on fossil fuel. Now it's going to be replaced by a new energy system that is not based on fossil fuel, based on renewables. It may be part of it at the beginning, but we are actually at the point that there are lots of converging trends as well. For example, 5G is arriving, but one of the biggest impact is going to be on the energy sector. Imagine the energy producing assets and energy consuming assets. Right now, we are already using pretty high technology to monitor them, but they are still human intervention. But down the road, they will be talking to each other. The energy consuming assets will tell how much energy should be produced so that they will be coordinating among themselves.
Conrad, I'm thinking, when you thought of all this with your partners, did you also take into account what you thought was internal politics in the PRC with Beijing, and the focus now, if you think about it, with common prosperity and the focus of capital towards enterprises and activities that they think will benefit all of society? So this is a less of the focus of what was before in terms of Tencent on video gaming, Alibaba in terms of shopping, and this whole focus on social media, which, you know, in the recent year and a half, Beijing has determined that was not the avenue they want to focus on, nor was it something like education. But infrastructure is constant. There is constant discussions about how to clean up the environment, how to reduce China's reliance on fossil fuels. There is constant discussion about how to take China to the next level of technology in all sorts of industries. Did you guys discuss that when you were?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is probably one of the three most important things in doing business in China. One, you need to have the domain knowledge, because in China, you cannot be rent seeking, because that is a socialist country. So you need to have your domain knowledge to create enough alpha to justify your own carry. And then the second important thing is that you have to understand how Chinese works. I'm talking about local stakeholders, local languages, and local practices. So these are things that you have to know about. But last but not least is also the government policies. Some of these things that we saw last year, including the regulatory intervention in the education sector, as well as gaming or
property development.
Property development. These were all written on the walls 5-6 years ago. Looking back at our industry, for example, you may have heard a lot about this last year. China has to become reach carbon peak by 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2060. It was talked about last year, but guess what? It was actually in the planning back in 2016 and 17. Our firm, which was not set up by then, but our colleagues were involved in those planning process with the government. We advised the government on, for example, which country they should look at in terms of formulating the subsidy hours for wind power. So we actually went to Germany together and helped them to understand how other regimes work and come up with a similar, if not enhanced regime. So these were things that were already in the planning, just like other things in other sectors, but we are more involved with the field that we are involved with. And also our field definitely has a longer runway. It's also a longer trend, longer planning process as well.
Of course. Large scale infrastructure. It's interesting also in terms of the point that you made, which is you need time. China requires a huge investment of time and discussion and building out that relationship and show your value added. So for all those firms that are expecting all those people instant rewards and instant success, it's actually very difficult to materialize. In terms of what's your view with asset management, the whole asset management industry? Because one thing we've seen in the last 10 years is the rise of ETFs taking over a lot of what was traditional asset management, which is why you were smart to get out and to focus on alternative investments. But even then, alternative investments in terms of hedge funds, in terms of specific types of asset classes, they've underperformed. There've always been a number that have overperformed, but in general, on average, both asset management and hedge funds underperform what is, whether you use the S&P 500 or some sort of weighted type of index across asset classes. What do you think is going to happen with asset management as an industry?
I don't know. I have absolutely no idea, just like 10 years ago. But I certainly believe that there is still a very good future for the asset management industry, because we do need to allocate capital smartly. And that is the real function of asset management. You are not being sold, but you're actually making your own purchase decision, i.e. your capital allocation decisions. This will continue to evolve, and it would require different kind of skill sets, and things will be done differently. We are in a period of time that politics probably have a stronger impact than the average in history. These are things all have to be taken into consideration. But I cannot see ourselves, meaning mankind, moving away from the capitalist system,
Yep.
capitalistic system. Because even China, which is a socialist, the market economy is not something that foreign to them anymore. But I would certainly encourage everyone to think about something that is evolving, because what we have learned first in 2008 was capitalism was getting a bit out of control, and we need to be more inclusive.
Yeah.
Guess what? This happened again in 2018. Nothing has changed.
Yes.
But I'm afraid that this time around we are going to see some real changes, because
Actually, I would say the situation is worse now than it was in 2008. If you look at income disparity, you look at political instability across regions, across countries, it is much more severe than 2008. 2008 was just the beginning, but that was more of an economic impact of almost close to depression. But now we're reaping that after 10 years of the current system. And something must change. I'm just thinking about the asset management though industry, something that you mentioned, the 10-year track record, which is very applicable, because even if things remain, there will be fee compression.
Yep.
That means the industry, unless it's niche industries like what you are focused on, will face revenue pressure. And then revenue pressure will mean expense pressure, less people doing more work. And that generally has been the case even on the sell side for the last 30 years of increasing amount of revenue per person to be generated.
Yeah, these things are going to happen. And hopefully by that time, I would either have retired or, or doing something differently.
Understood. You know, the other thing I want to talk about was to just give people an idea. We touched about the industry. In your own career, as you've rose and you also looked at different asset classes, what do people expect in terms of compensation? Because you have a lot of people graduating now. They've always got an idea, but it's generally all wrong in terms of the data that they may have been able to get, and it's always better to hear from the source, especially someone like yourself who owns a company, and when they look to hire people, what are people what are you thinking about in terms of compensation for different levels of experience, especially people coming in?
Okay, I will tell you one important experience I had when I was running a team at a larger organization, and it was around the time of GFC. Suddenly, I was told that we now have to increase the salary of everyone after the GFC, because this is a better alignment of interests. I was shocked.
Is that base salary or total
base
comp?
salary? Base salary.
Base, okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't make a lot of sense then.
Yeah, to me that was counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But it happened, and it didn't last for very long. But what I have picked up was I can arbitrarily name a number, $125,000 US for a VP, or a $250,000 US per annum for an MD. All these things are actually quite meaningless, because at one stage in your career, you should start to hit a base salary ceiling. Because by design, our industry, I mean the world, is a capitalistic world, and there is a equilibrium that has already been founded. How capital share profits with people with talent. And that is what commonly known as the 20% carry interest. So if you have nothing but just some good ideas and some talents, and then you can get someone's money to implement your ideas, your cut is 20%. There's once you get beyond that base salary ceiling or mindset, you should be thinking about that. When you're working with capital, deploying capital or moving capital or raising capital, that is the equilibrium established over the last probably 60, 70 years. Because there were some other GPs that tried to raise it, they didn't quite get it. Some people who try to lower it, then they don't generate the performance. So that is the equilibrium that we know in our society. And then you should at some stage start to think about yourself. Are you generating enough value to deserve that 20% cut? I think that is a very interesting way of looking at one's career. Because at some stage, you should be thinking about what you can contribute to the firm versus why the firm should pay you an ultra high base salary.
Conrad, you are now speaking like a boss and a manager and an owner of the business. I would suspect that most employees for the first 10 years, 15 years, they are thinking about what they're worth. The problem is that at least definitely my experience on the sell side is that they always think they're worth a lot more than the bosses are willing to pay. So therein lies the conflict. And if you have to look at what is the objective view of it, it's ultimately going to come down to some form of negotiation, or they'll have to look outside to see if there's an external comp and so forth. But I think what you said is exactly right. It's what everyone should do. But you need also a certain amount of experience and maturity to do that. And and think about, if you've worked 28 years, you've gained a lot. I think that word of advice is very important. Hopefully that the people going through their careers now in the earlier stage realize it a lot quicker. I think the other topic I want to touch upon about the future is that Hong Kong is our home for you and I. We built our careers in Hong Kong. We've seen it go from 1997 Asian financial crisis to now, okay, where we've got massive US-China geopolitics, okay? We've gone through several years of social unrest, and then on top of that, we've got COVID. I think a lot of people that have gone through what we've gone through were a bit concerned about the future of Hong Kong. What's your view? Is Hong Kong still the place for young people to come and build their careers like it was for us?
Yes, I certainly believe so. I think the better days of Hong Kong are still ahead of us. Even though right now we are in a pretty rough environment, but the fact that China is progressing, it creates a huge amount of opportunities that we could never dream of in the past, and they are still mushrooming every day. So Hong Kong is the best place that you can capitalize on those, while you also maintain the exposure to the rest of the world.
Good. I mean, that's good to hear some positive news, some positive outlook.
But let me give you the caveat as well. It's not going to be easy. Because the path going forward is definitely not something straight, wide, and smooth. But that is also the opportunity for someone to spend the time, understand and analyze it well, and find the best way to get there. For example, I think one of the biggest mistakes that one can make at this crossroad is, let's just fall back on China. China, our mainland, our motherland, is a huge country. But frankly, there's a billion of people up there. How can you differentiate yourself from them? you need to find a special role for yourself. And especially during the last probably 10, 15 years, at one stage, I still recall vividly that Zhu Rongji was on a trip and he was annoyed by the reporter because the
Yes,
first
I remember that.
they asked him,
Yes.
is Hong Kong the New York of China? Yeah, but what about Shanghai? Well, and then when he got to Canada, then people asked, so is Hong Kong the Toronto of China? He got fed up. But I don't blame him for that, because I think for people in Hong Kong, like us and our children, we have to be not the New York of China. We should strive to become the London of Asia.
Yes.
Let me tell you why. Because the most important thing is that if you are New York of China, you are relying on the mainland. But the British way of doing things, I don't think is a secret that doesn't match well with a lot of Europeans, continental European views. But they still have their own competitive advantage or competitive edges that you have to do business in London. It is still one of the top financial centers. And Hong Kong has to strive for that. And there are great opportunities that we can capitalize on. Just to mention a very simple analogy, I worked in 2 American companies in the past. Somehow London plays a special role because London is the international headquarters. But think about it this way. Hong Kong can be an international headquarters for a Chinese company as well. And a Chinese company, they may actually need to spin out their subsidiaries and list it in Hong Kong in order to access the Western market. And Hong Kong is a good position to do that. And more importantly, it doesn't need to be just the Western market. We can be accessing all the emerging markets in Latin America, Southeast Asia, as well as Central Europe. So there are lots of things that we can do. It brings me back to memories of going to the Middle East back in 2005. I was one of the very few Chinese that were walking around in Middle East back then. But I found something. I found a lot of petrodollars that was ready to be deployed. And that was one of the very
Excellent
opportunity that I was lucky to have.
It's quite ironic. I just had a recent conversation with a friend about this similar point, which is for Hong Kong's future to be bright, Hong Kong must find a way to add value to China rather than as we encounter problems that we have gone through since 1997. We've always just relied on China to help us solve the problem. That's not going to make Hong Kong great again. We
That's
really
right.
need to find a niche that's something that we can do that China once again values, no different than it was during most of our career, especially the early part. Hong Kong's GDP versus China's GDP was massive back then because of the value we could add.
Yeah. Don't forget that some of these answers are actually in our DNA.
Yes.
Our fathers, grandfathers, all came to Hong Kong from the mainland for good reasons. It is in the DNA that they survive and they pass the DNA to us. So arguably, we are the best subsector of Chinese that can champion Belt and Road.
Right. That's an interesting take. That's all I can say. Any advice now? I think we're getting to the last point of our discussion, which is any advice that you could give to potential graduates graduating shortly, as well as recently graduates from Stern. Any thoughts that you have, be it career-wise, how to navigate the current global situation, and so forth?
Yeah, because no doubt we are in more turbulent times than average. However, there is one thing that I read and learned and internalized is the importance of focusing on your circle of influence rather than your circle of concerns, especially during the unrest period of 2019 in Hong Kong. You can worry about a lot of things, but to me, getting to work was my priority and my right as well. And I continue to do my job. And I focus on what I am good at and what I'm trained for. And make sure that you don't get distracted by the noises.
Deal with the issues that you can deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And don't spend your time just worrying about things you cannot control.
Exactly. Yeah.
Good words of advice. Well, thank you, Conrad. That was very informative and very enjoyable. I'm sure I can speak for everyone and say thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.